So, Josh, we're on week 2 of the stay-at-home ordinance, and we're back at doing the podcast. What's our topic this week?
Yeah, so this week we have one that has been on my mind for a while, something that's been a topic that has been in the news for quite a while now, several years. It's gotten more and more news coverage, and that is the Democratic divide. Is there this big divide in the Democratic Party between progressives and Democrats and or establishment Democrats? Is the divide as big as it seems? Is it as bad in terms of, is it going to break in half? Is the party going to split? And going over what is this divide? Who's in what camp? What do they believe? Things like that.
Cool. Well, let's take a look.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting. I know there's a lot of discussion surrounding, a divide within the Democratic Party. But I also know that it can be fodder for media companies to just kind of latch onto, because any sort of conflict seems to be newsworthy these days. Have you found the same thing? Do you think of it in the same terms, or is the divide that big? I don't know if it is.
Look, I know what you mean when you mention the media there. It's like all President Trump has to do is misspell a word in a tweet, and that is all they talk about for a week. They just go nuts over it. So any little thing they latch onto. However, the divide, I believe, is as prominent, if not maybe even more prominent than anyone in the mainstream media is giving attention to. I personally say more because I think they just don't really get it. It seems like they don't understand why a lot of progressives seem to be quite upset with the establishment, and they seem very stunned that anyone would want to say, like, anyone would give any resistance when they say get in line. So just like they did in 2016, and so I think the Democratic divide is there, and especially with the recent results now that I'm going to go ahead and just assume, like, Biden is the nominee. It looks it would take an act of God to change that. So with Biden as the nominee, it really does hinge on a couple decisions he makes, how the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, kind of acts in terms of everything from VP, cabinet picks, policies, and so on moving forward. Because between now and Election Day, now and inauguration, if Biden wins, just a few decisions could determine whether the party gets united or maybe even split. But and I'm excited to go into more details later, but I want to see what you think. If you think I'm off the mark, on the mark.
I've seen it differently. I've always seen that the idea of an establishment is kind of an unseen boogeyman, somebody to direct anger and resentment towards, when the reality is you have a political organization which, for all intents and purposes, is a private organization made up of party members and donors. You can call them the establishment, but they're not unified. They're not monolithic, and to cast aspersions upon them, especially for somebody like Bernie Sanders to cast aspersions on them, is to me labeling an unknown boogeyman. Now, typically they refer to somebody like Bernie Sanders as a populist, so I think it's important that we kind of differentiate populism from establishment politics. So I've always seen establishment as the kind of the gatekeepers, the people that are inside that kind of determine the rules of the road. Have you ever looked at it differently?
No, essentially the way I've always described it is, I know this might even be an oversimplification, but if you believe that we don't need any significant change to system, we need to just keep things the way they are, maybe a little bit of course correction, then that's more establishment. If you're a populist, you do believe that something in the system, like healthcare, when I say the system, healthcare or wages or education, things like that, need to be drastically changed, drastically upended, and modified in some way. But if the idea of significantly changing a particular part of the system, like healthcare or education, is uneasy, that's more of an establishment point of view. And the reason I break it down that way is it kind of helps. Whenever I've talked to certain people, it kind of helps them see like where they might feel, because there'll be some populist politicians you like and don't like, some establishment politicians you like and don't like. So I think it's hard for a lot of people to really see like where would I fall on this thing. So yeah, personally, I see it as and progressives are a populist movement, I would say. I don't know if you agree with me there. It is.
Well, the way I've seen the difference between the two, and I think you're largely hitting the nail on the head. I think the establishment, quote unquote, is largely people who understand that the way to move forward as a society is through policy, not through ideology. And the more pragmatic you are, the more centrist you by default become. And you may embrace those views that those on the fringe or those on the outside of it will see as establishment. Whereas populists, I see more as ideologically driven, with good intention a lot of times, but not a strong underlying policy or a way to bring about those things that would incorporate not just members in their own party, but members of the opposition party as well. So that's why I think they're idealistic, because they shoot very high and miss the other side of the group when they try to formulate that into policy.
But do you have like, if you were to pick like a few issues and say like, all right, this is what a populist wants to do, this is what an establishment supporter, voter, or politician wants to do, in terms of specific issues, do they differ quite a bit? Do you see? Because I'm trying to see like, are the progressives that far? Because a lot of progressives feel like they are miles away from Biden. And in fact, they, at least a hell of a lot of people I've spoken to feel like Biden is closer to Trump on policies and his history of voting than he is to a progressive. And partly because in a recent interview, he said even if Medicare for All passed in the House and Senate, he would still veto it. And that kind of enraged some. And the crime bill, as well as the bankruptcy bill for credit card companies, there were some things he's been involved in that I think in today's day and age definitely hurts you more if you're a Democrat, in my opinion.
Well, I think the reason that people are frustrated with that, what they would call an establishment point of view on those topics, really is the fault not of the Democratic Party, but of the Republican Party. When you have an institution or organization that basically gets to the table and says, hey, we're not going to negotiate with you, and they just walk away from the table, then it causes those more moderate members in the Democratic Party to start to lean to the right or to the center to get them back over to their side of the table. So if you look at somebody like Chuck Schumer has been giving the same speech on the floor of the House and Senate for 30 years. And that speech is, maybe now it's time that our friends cross the aisle and sit down at the table and negotiate with us. So he's been giving this speech. Republicans have been refusing to cooperate, and as a result, it is inflaming the flank of the left to see immediate results and immediate action, and to just bulldoze the political right. So it's a problem and a solution that can be solved not by Democrats, but by Republicans.
Here's my theory in terms of the divide on both sides is I believe that it isn't like someone radical on the left and radical on the right has suddenly like drawn swaths of people like even though Bernie has been more of like the leader on the left, and then yet people like Trump and Bannon on the right. I think it was a lot more underlying, and I feel like the center has almost like pushed more people out as they've seen the country, like income inequality, for instance. They feel more and more people feel crowded out. And what concerns me is, we have this typical idea of like being in the middle, you're going to get a lot of people, you're going to get a lot of votes, you have a huge tent. But if people feel very crowded out, it's possible that a middle centrist policy ends up appealing to neither instead of both sides. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, but that's also kind of the nature of politics. You don't get everything you want. You get what you need to take a baby step forward. Don't you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, my only question is, I'm basically wondering, and I think this question goes for anyone in the Republican Party as well, because whether it's this year or in 4 years, President Trump is not going to be running for re-election, or he won't be in 4 years, and the next Republican group to come up, like, I honestly don't know if they will have another, mainstream Republican quite like a George W. Bush. I think, at least for the next couple elections, we're going to see someone a little more along the lines ideologically of President Trump. And I hope I'm wrong on that. Like,
I think you are. And
okay.
The reason I think you are is because if you are wanting to win, and you know that he's the most bombastic within that crowd, and he can only get up to 42 or 43%, you can't really win with those numbers, right? You need somebody that can appeal across the aisle. I've been saying that the cause and solution to this is the Republican Party, and what they need to do is kind of purge the outliners, the outsiders, or the populists from the party. And that has to happen within the party. And that typically comes as a result of those that are funding the party. So, if they want to win elections and have policy that is crafted that does not hurt them as business leaders and so forth, they may start looking at this fringe element as being the most divisive, destructive way to get their policy ends. So, they may start to shift towards the center and leave that fringe group out on the outline. That's what I'm hoping happens. And I think that's the solution to this. But at the same time, that populist group is also their most ardent supporters, who may, take offense to having their most cherished policies sidelined.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, I think the uprising, and I mean, think of it this way: on the left, I have some research in that article where in 2008 primary, and I know these are comparing these two candidates is not apples to apples, but at the same time, in the 2008 primary, there was someone who really stood out as the like populist candidate, and That was Dennis Kucinich. I'm not sure if you remember him.
Oh yeah, I remember Dennis.
Yeah, and he was a funny guy, and he averaged less than 1% of the vote, and he dropped out right before South Carolina. He only made it through 4 states in the primary, and that was 2008. Fast forward 8 years, and you have Bernie Sanders, who yes is a better politician than Dennis Kucinich in a lot of ways, and everything, and he had a more refined message. But the populist gets 43% of the primary vote. That shows like a very growing movement and a growing percentage of the populist base that seems like they are, I guess, being left behind, being ignored, like that the party, and just like a lot of Republican voters feel like, their party just keeps running to Wall Street or big corporations to help them and leaves the working class behind. If you think the divide, because I just wonder if the divide is growing more and more vertically than it is horizontally, meaning like, a lot of populists on the right agree with a lot of progressives on economic ideas and policies and ending war, investing here in America, putting the money here, things like that. And so I wonder if instead of being divided left to right, we're becoming more divided vertically in terms of like, the wealthier versus the rest.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So if you look at somebody who's 29 or 30 and they look at their parents or grandparents and how they grew up or how they went to college or how they planned medical expenses, they didn't have nearly the problems that somebody under the age of 45 has. You know, so, and a lot of those problems are problems that have had solutions presented in Congress, but one side of the aisle walks away from the table.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it is exacerbating the populism of the political left, like you said. So yeah, it is. There is a class issue to it. There is an age issue to it, and the solution to it is moderation on the political right more than it is on the political left. So if the political right were to see that, hey, this health care plan Obama did was a Republican idea that worked well in Massachusetts, maybe we should at the very least support that. And then, the Democrats might negotiate a public option in there. Then you would see a moderation of the progressive party because they're getting something of what they want, not everything, and they wouldn't be, back to the wall, fighting. So yeah, I think there's a moderation that can happen just by a simple cooperation. One of the things that's always kind of bothered me is whenever you have somebody who is a populist, either on the political left or the right, if they're on the right, they're immediately labeled Hitler. And if they're on the left, they're immediately labeled, Marxist or,
Right.
wanting
Right.
to bring us down to Castro's Cuba. So, have you heard this a lot? What do you think is the danger in promoting that idea and going to a worst case scenario? Where's the line in the sand?
Yeah, no, I love that question just because it does drive me nuts. I hear it like 24/7, and it drives me nuts even when I hear it about people on the right because uh, it, first of all, is factually incorrect when you look at any policies like on the right, their economic policies are so completely different from like Hitler's Germany. It's not even, and I think it also I disagree with it in a moral sense because you're basically like, for me to say that is me telling someone else that's a little to the right of me, that they are closer ideologically to Hitler, whereas like they can feel someone could be a lot more right than me and feel the exact same way I do about Hitler, you know? So to me, like I know we have the left and right spectrum, but I personally don't even think, fascism and communism really even belong on that spectrum. They are on like a different thing of itself because someone could be extremely right and have no ideological similarities, want nothing to do with like fascism of Hitler. And then you have people on the left who, on the progressive side, who do not want anything to do with Marxism in terms of like government controlling the means of production entirely.
Or the finance industry, or
Yeah,
the automotive industry.
exactly. I mean that's the thing is if um, on the left, it's like the big question is, and I'll admit it is a harder line to draw. Like on the right, they have a much easier, crystal clear line. Like as long as you don't believe in racial superiority, you know, you're good. But on the left, it is harder because Marxism was born from a lot of the ideas of uh, things that the state should be able to provide that went way too far, and it is questions about like the private sector. So essentially, should there be a private sector, and what role does the private sector play? And someone like AOC, who I even say is very far left, she does not want to control means of production and the banking industry. There's a big difference between regulating it and government controlling it. And what I've told people on the right is if if a politician wants to implement a regulation, that means they have no interest in controlling it and owning, finance, because if they owned it and ran it, they wouldn't need to regulate it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people, a lot of progressives at least that I've heard, your AOC, your Bernie Sanders, even Dennis Kucinich, they point to countries like Denmark, not Cuba, right? When
Right.
they're talking about what policies they want to enact, I usually hear Denmark. Don't you hear the same thing?
I do, and even though in some ways that is like an apt, and especially if you're on a campaign trail and you got like 8.7 seconds to answer every question, that's an apt thing to do. But I think there's a much, much better comparison that should have been made, that can be made, and that would resonate more in America and be more accurate, and that is FDR. It's like we're not trying to be Denmark. We're trying to be the country like FDR envisioned, where the politicians worked for the working class.
I kind of want to steer back to Denmark because I've been doing a little research on Denmark because it always comes up with progressives. Like, why can't we be more like Denmark? And the pushback is typically, well, Denmark has, a fifth or a sixth of the population we have. So, and actually, that's a huge overestimate. They have about 6 million people in Denmark, and we have about 350 million. Their GDP is about 320 billion, and our GDP is just under 20 trillion. So our workforce and our population is 60 times larger than theirs, and our GDP is also 60 times larger than theirs. And so the argument for progressives is if Denmark can do it under the same arithmetic, then so can the United States. And so, there is an argument to be made for the progressives. And I don't think it's so much how do we pay for it as much as how do we politically pull it off. So, Josh, one of the things that I've noticed about populism, and it doesn't matter what time stamp is on it, it doesn't matter what country it's in, when we see populist candidates or populist politicians come about, one of the things they tap on most is inequality. Now, whether that is an economic inequality or a class inequality, or like here in the United States, a healthcare inequality, it usually is what rallies people to the populist as someone who has answers. Have you noticed the same thing in your reading and your research? Do you see a lot of that? Because that seems to be the primary force that I see.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's primarily the reason why in 2008 we were. Although keep in mind, like President Obama definitely did his campaign messaging and everything. His rhetoric was a lot more progressive than his presidency. Understandably so. Like um, um, he basically, when you get it elected, you have to work with people on the other side of the aisle. Like you're not going to get everything you want, so it's not like a criticism of him. But even though he was a little more progressive, nothing compared to like Bernie Sanders and how much it's grown. Like I mentioned, Dennis Kucinich, and nobody knew who Bernie Sanders was, and even in the year 2000. Ralph Nader ran on his whole platform was there is this political, economic corruption, Wall Street owning politicians. It's creating this inequality that is going to make things bad. Everyone thought he was a joke, and then the financial crisis happened, and I think that spawned uh, the progressive movement, the populism on the left, and the aftermath spawned it on the right, meaning, GDP shot back up. The wealthy were doing better, and yet a lot of their communities are doing worse. I know that in like Michigan, after the financial crisis, the working and middle class people, the poverty rate, sorry, in Michigan, the poverty rate since the crisis has just skyrocketed. More and more people going into poverty. I think something like 300% increase. And you look at things like opioid crisis, and people are working harder and harder. They're picking up more jobs. They're working in this gig economy with no security. Yet you have people like Jamie Dimon, who was the CEO of
Oh, yeah.
JP Morgan. Yeah, and right before the financial crisis, he was worth $50 million. Now he's worth 800 million, and it's like, find me one other American who was working class at the time of the financial crisis and now has seen their wealth increase that much.
Yeah,
Um,
it seems as though that inequality not only crafts the message, it creates profits, right? Like if we don't change, this is going to happen, and you have your Ralph Naders and your Bernie Sanders and your Elizabeth Warrens who warn of these collapses based on these policies, and then when they come into fruition, they're seen no longer as a nomad in the desert. They're now seen as a leader who knows and understands the situation. And Trump very much capitalized on that too. He was more of a Monday morning quarterback than he was somebody that was profiting or excuse me, professing of calamity that was coming. Even if he did do that, it was hyperbolic and there wasn't a lot of academia behind it. Whereas, somebody like Warren or Sanders really kind of was prophetic in their calling of these policies as well as Nader was. So I think on the left they kind of get legitimized by looking at the numbers and the research of those in those circles and kind of using that to fuel their message, and as a result, it creates a prophetic sort of style of leadership.
if I told you in 2008 that a Republican would win the nomination by saying the war in Iraq was a mistake, and that we're going to pull out of all these wars, and that they support a progressive tax rate. Would you have believed me?
No, I mean, it would have been inside out from what they had traditionally stood for.
Exactly. And, it almost is, at, for populists on the left, they look at it and they say, okay, if I said the Democratic candidate who was going to win the nomination is one who supported and co-wrote a bankruptcy bill that made it so a working class person still was on the hook for their credit card debt even after filing bankruptcy, whereas someone like Donald Trump could start a business that just tanks and he can walk away scot free, owing nothing if he declares bankruptcy. I think a lot of them would have said, "You're out of your mind."
Yeah.
And so it causes a massive shift in politics, but it also causes like the center to dig in a little deeper. Like, for instance, I would say that Biden is, even in some cases, more to the center or to the right than Hillary was. And it seems like the anti-populist left dug their heels in a bit more.
I recently downloaded a book called Hitler's First 100 Days, and it talks a lot about kind of the same situation we're in, where there's hyperpolarization. There is, boycotts of Jewish stores in Germany was one of the things that they did. Here in the United States, we haven't gotten to that boiling point yet, but there's a lot of similarities, through our election process and, these ICE officials making mass arrests and things that are very disconcerting. And they are fueled by right-wing anger in the same way that populist rhetoric is fueled by frustration and anger over the costs of things and just simply living in the United States. So that's what I've been starting to read. I just got the book, and I'm anxious to look at the correlations. Obviously, I understand that Nazi Germany was an extreme, but at the same time, they had political organizations that very much were similar to the United States. They had a conservative, kind of old guard. They had a liberal democratic party. The way of the Kaiser was almost dead by then, but then you had a nationalist socialist party, the Nazis, rising up and ready to just kind of steamroll into a one-party government. And the reason I keep going back to the cause and solution to this being the Republican Party is the last thing we need in the United States is a one-party system. We need a give and take. We need a mechanism by which both political organizations can find common ground, and we have that. It's just being underutilized. So I'm really excited to read this book, and I know that you've been reading some stuff too, and I'm interested as to what books we can recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And one I've started reading, I haven't gotten that much through, maybe a third of the way through, and it's a book called The Populist Guide to 2020: A New Right and New Left Are Rising, and it's by Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti. They are co-hosts of the show called The Rising on the Hill. So on YouTube, if you Google the Rising, they would pull up Rising or Crystal Ball, Sagar Enjeti. Any of them would pull up the show, and basically Crystal, very progressive left. Sagar he's not like the stereotype a lot of progressives would have of a populist on the right. He basically hates the establishment like Mitch McConnell, and he also hates Donald Trump because Donald Trump kind of just played into and exploited people's need for change.
Is he more like the philosophical conservative, like a David Frum or a David Brooks type of conservative?
Yeah, I would say so, except he is more vocal about how he says, like, no more libertarian economic nonsense. Like,
Interesting.
he hates the libertarian, like, I guess to him, more a conservative, someone who's fiscally conservative. And this is what I've always said, like, nobody is fiscally conservative, because if you're fiscally conservative, you want to slash spending and hike up taxes. That way you can generate more revenue and pay off the debt. And but no Republican wants to do that. They just kind of still buy into this kind of libertarian economics, and how they just keep turning their back on working class voters, and how it's hurting their party. And so this book is largely based on the idea that both political parties have kind of gotten away with just passing bill after bill that does very much disproportionately favor people at the top.
The entire country is starting to gravitate in that direction, and I think in the next podcast we're going to be talking a little bit more about how the country is changing rather quickly to those ideas. So I think we could probably wrap it up here, Josh. I want to mention these two books again: Hitler's First 100 Days and The Populist Guide to 2020.
Yep.
Yeah, so this has been a great conversation, Josh. I can't wait to see you again and do this in person.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right, sir. Stay safe. Keep washing your hands, and we wish everybody health and happiness and safety during these troubling times.
Absolutely.
You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com.